Hello and welcome to another episode of DM 101. I am Mark Sherlock Humes, the Dungeon Master for High Rollers, the weekly D&D stream over on twitch.tv/yogscast every Sunday at 5 PM GMT. And this is my little series where I am slowly trying to help people get into the art of games mastering or dungeon mastering, whatever you want to call it. Helping people especially who are new to the hobby that want to start GMing or DMing but maybe don't know where to start. Over the last few episodes we've talked about a variety of topics, but right now we are kind of slowly talking about world building as a whole. This is something very important to a lot of GMs who want to move away from the more established modules, the kind of pre-written adventures, and start creating their own stuff. We talked a bit about kind of creating that kind of initial steps in creating your own homebrew world, about world history, about timelines, about important events, etc. And today we're going to be moving on to what I think is kind of the next logical step in that process, which is talking about world maps. Now, world maps, you've probably, you've got the famous ones like maps of Middle-earth for Lord of the Rings. Almost in most campaign settings that you buy will come with an elaborate world map. If you read fantasy fiction, it's kind of a staple of fantasy fiction to have a map at the beginning of the book. Now, in terms of D&D and other RPGs, a world map is a nice to have. It is not a necessity to play the game. You do not need a world map, even if you want to build your own worlds. It is one of those things which, like miniatures, like battle mats, like soundscapes or soundtracks, they are very nice. They can add an authenticity. They can add another element and kind of like involved play for your players, but they are not necessary. They are a lot of fun though. The idea of a world map is to give your players an idea of where stuff is, how long roughly it takes to get somewhere, but also where nearby could be cool and interesting to explore, and that's a particularly important one for me. I think world maps really encourage the explorative style of game that you would probably associate more with sandbox RPGs like Skyrim. The idea, think about, RPGs like Skyrim, you bring up the world map, you're wandering around, oh, that place looks cool, oh, it's appeared on my minimap, oh, little interesting thing, oh, I'll go check that out. And it leads to this game which encourages exploration. If you want to run a game which is focused entirely around a single city and is more like a spy intrigue, or you want to go with some real classic dungeon crawling, very little story, just kick in the door, kill a bunch of monsters, get the loot, then a world map probably isn't going to be very beneficial to you. But if you want that sort of more open world, sandbox style of game, a world map can really, really help you. In this video, we are going to be talking about world maps specifically. We will cover things like city maps, dungeon maps, battle maps, that sort of thing in the future, but right now we're going to be talking mainly about world maps. In terms of topics that we're going to be covering, we're going to be talking about the tools that I use to make my maps, as well as a bunch of other digital tools available online that you can use if you'd like. We're going to be talking a little bit about the idea of geography and sort of like some common map mistakes that a lot of people make. We're going to be talking a little bit about the idea of building out or building in and a bunch of other stuff as well, but those are the kind of the main topics. I will, as always, put links to the relevant parts of the video in the description below if you'd like to jump ahead. The first thing we're going to talk about though is the digital tools, and I just want to preface all of this video, as always, I am not an expert map maker, I am not an expert world builder, I am not a fantasy author with tons of books behind my name like Brandon Sanderson. This is just my own experience, this is my personal opinion, and it's very much designed to be, if you don't know anything, if you don't know what to do, here's some suggestions. At no point am I trying to say that this is the right way of doing it or that my way is best. This is just to give some new people ideas of what you can use and some things to think about. But enough of that, let's move on to talking about digital tools. So let's talk about digital tools then, and I should really just completely get this out of the way first. You do not need to use digital tools to make maps. You can use a piece of paper and a pencil, and that is absolutely fine, especially if you are really just creating maps for your own reference. If it's not something that you want to share with your players, or you're not going to publish it, you can just use a piece of paper and a pencil and figure things out, and you've got your own self-referential guide there. That said, we do live in a digital age, and that means that there are some great digital tools out there which can do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. They come preloaded with brushes, or you can make, landscapes look nicer. You can do it at a much larger scale and then shrink it down. They just make things a lot easier. And I'm going to start off by talking about what I personally use, and that is Adobe Photoshop from the Adobe suite. Now, this is a program which, quite honestly, is probably going to be out of a lot of people's price range. It can be quite expensive. It takes a bit of time to learn to use, and if you're just using a mouse, it's also probably not the best option. It works better for users that have digital tablets, Wacom tablets, that sort of thing. The reason I use it is because it is just what I've known. It's what I've grown up using. I just have spent a lot of time with Photoshop. I happen to have access to a tablet, a Wacom tablet, one of their new entry-level ones, and it just makes things much easier in that regard. The reason that I like Photoshop and the reason that I spent time learning to use Photoshop is for a couple of reasons. One, I love their custom brushes. You may not be familiar with this if you're not a regular Photoshop user, but you can actually download custom brush packs that basically give you shapes that you can just plop down, or give you certain types of brush strokes. And these range, I use a bunch of them from like map icons, things like mountains and forests and things like that, to things like water stains to kind of add that old school feeling to my maps. You can even, one of the ones that I've started using recently, because the maps that I'm making aren't going to be for publishing or for sharing beyond my own game group, is I found somebody on DeviantArt that has all of the Skyrim UI icons as brushes. So you can use the little markers for settlements and towns and dungeons, that sort of thing. And that's really nice. They're really nicely designed UI pieces, and they look really good on a fantasy map as well. And if you've got gamers in the group, they'll recognize it, and it's like, oh, wow, that's really cool. So that's really nice. In terms of things like mountains and forests and things like that, I happen to use a set of brushes called Sketchy Cartography. I will try and include links down in the video description below. Very good. I like their mountains and their forests. They're very scalable and easy to kind of place around. They do individuals along with kind of groups of things, and it just looks quite nice. It kind of gives it a very Tolkien-esque feel to your map, which is pretty cool. So, and the other reason I like Photoshop is because of layering. Now, this is something where if you use free programs like GIMP, G-I-M-P, not the BDSM thing, it's an actual art program called GIMP. I just pronounce it GIMP because that's what it spells. Anyway, that is basically a free version of a very light Photoshop style program. So you can use it for the same things. I don't know if it is compatible with Photoshop brushes. One thing, I don't use it, so I don't know, but it is out there. The nice thing with these programs, Photoshop, GIMP, all that kind of stuff, is it has the ability to add a translucent layer on top of what you're working on. So rather than a piece of paper where you draw on it, and then if you draw on it again and you mess up, you kind of ruin everything. With layers, you can apply stuff. So what I normally do is create like a base layer of the landscape, then I add a second layer, and that's for my mountains. And then I do another layer, and that's for my forests. And then I do another layer, and that's my rivers. Another layer, and that's my towns, etc. And it means that if you messed up, or if you want to change stuff, it's very easy to go in and adjust that. And it just means that you can kind of see what you're working on. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but I also happen to use layers. It's very handy for working out things like tectonic plates, and things like that as well. That is pretty much why I use those styles of program, but don't worry if you're a little bit intimidated by things like Photoshop, or you don't really worry about the cost, etc., and you don't use the free programs. There are other options available. One which I have been really interested in from the start, it is currently in a sort of ongoing beta, sort of like open use, but it's probably going to eventually kind of have some sort of subscription model, is called Incarnate. It's very cool. It is basically a sort of Adobe Photoshop purely for maps. It works by, you create a sort of like landscape, you can put down mountains and forests, and you can color the terrain, and you can put down cities, and it looks very nice. It's very kind of like clean illustration style, makes really good looking maps. It is currently free. I'll literally put the link in the description below. You can go and check it out. Hopefully I'll have some footage of what it looks like as well throughout this section of the video. But yeah, you can go in and you can play stuff around. What I will say about Incarnate is it is very good for small scale maps. So if you're kind of working on the region around a town, or you're making a small part of a larger world, it's very good. It doesn't seem to be very good for doing large scale maps right now. It is kind of restricted to a particular size window. I find it's a little bit limiting for the larger style maps, like full world maps, but it's great for that kind of shrunk in, here's a town and the surrounding areas and things like that. And that is very important. Something we'll come to a bit later on is the idea of building outwards. You start small and then you expand outwards, and Incarnate's really, really good for that. So that's another program you can check out. As I said, I believe it is currently free to use, but it is, I think, planning to go with a sort of subscription or otherwise monetary based system, but it is a very good tool and I recommend it. If you want something a bit more focused on map creation, as opposed to an all-round art program like Photoshop, and you do have a little bit of money to spend, you can also check out Campaign Cartographer. This is a program which I know has been around for years and years, since sort of early Windows days. For people that wanted to make fantasy maps. It is a paid-for service, but you can buy bundles which include city builder programs, dungeon builder programs. Very, very cool. You can create maps super easy with it. Again, it has this whole thing of you kind of paint down the terrain and then you plant down mountains, you can adjust stuff, you can enter text. Very, very stylish, very, very slick. It is not one I am personally very familiar with. I have literally just seen it in videos. I've not bought it yet, but it is one I know gets recommended quite heavily, and is well worth checking out. Alongside all of those, and again, I will put the link to that. I believe it's a website called profantasy.com. I'll put a link to that in the description below. With all of these things, these are just tools and programs. They are not going to basically just go, here's a map for you. You do have to put a bit of work in. You have to understand how sort of like land masses work, and you have to kind of design it and draw it out. And that is really where I guess a lot of the skill comes down to. So what we're going to start talking about now is the process of designing worlds. Okay, so before we start drawing and giving some examples on some common geography things that you probably want to be aware of if you're making your own maps, let's just talk about some general tips. The first thing is, if you want to design a fantasy world, and you want to draw your own maps and you want to give them that kind of sense of realism, look at real world geography. Go on Google Maps on satellite view and look at a continent. You know that your climate for this continent is going to be similar to South America. Well, go and look at the satellite pictures of South America. Look at where the mountains, look at where the forests, look about the kind of landscape and that sort of thing. It can give you some ideas. That said, don't feel you have to follow Earth's kind of general appeal. The poles, the cold bits don't have to be at the top and bottom. You know, the world doesn't have to be a series of continents. It can be a donut shape. It could be a ring world. It could be a bunch of sketchy, thin, fractal land masses going all around. As long as you've got a good reason, as long as there's a cool explanation for why, you can make your map pretty much anything you want. And that's a key factor that I should probably have mentioned earlier in the video, is that map making is also storytelling in itself. Your map is telling a story of the world. How is it formed? Why is it the way it is? Who's where? What kingdoms are at war? Etc, etc, etc. If you're really stuck for an ideas of what your general mass should look like, your land mass should look like, one thing I've seen a lot of people do is you get a piece of paper, you get all of your D&D dice, so your D20, your D10, your D4, your D6, your D8, your D12, all of that stuff, you roll it onto the piece of paper and then draw an outline around like the whole dice as if it was one big group, and that gives you a vague continent landscape. Now, the two things I'm going to talk about here in terms of geography is I'm going to talk about mountains and rivers, because they're the two things that I've learned a few things about that I think I've got right. I actually learned a lot of this from Brandon Sanderson's world building talks and a little bit of research online. And again, Wikipedia, online research is all your friend in there. It's like, I don't know what parts, how a river works. Google it. I literally found kids like BBC, GCSE, sort of elementary school stuff that I never learned, or I certainly don't remember learning, that, you know, reminded me about what the parts of the river are called and how they work and stuff like that. So do that, have a research and things like that. Things we're going to talk about here is mountains and rivers. But first we're going to need an example kind of landscape. So we're just going to draw a random continent. The one thing about these is a continent should never look like that. It shouldn't have these smooth, they shouldn't really have these smooth lines, especially coastlines. You know, you could have a border like that, you could have a kingdom sort of borders set out like that, but, you know, coastal areas are irregular, so you're going to have more something like, you know, and even this, like, isn't a very good example because with a pen I can't really give it a good example, but, you know, you'd probably make more of this sort of look more this. And again, look at real world geography as examples of this, right? You go and look at like the coastline of, you know, Costa Rica or you know, South America, etc. It doesn't look smooth. It's generally pretty jagged. So let's talk about mountains then. Mountains are particularly important for geography because they form natural borders. Mountains are generally pretty impassable. Now in D&D you might argue that dwarves tunnel underneath them, elves can fly over them, or, you know, orcs love living in them or whatever. But generally mountains are seen as these impassable, dangerous places, so people like to settle between them. They don't really like to try and settle on them. Passing over them can be quite difficult. So mountain ranges are, you know, natural borders, and they can help split your landscape up into different regions. One thing I see is, and this is, I think a lot of people blame Tolkien for this, you see a lot of this. Like, there is one great lonely mountain in the northern kingdoms, and it is where the dragon lives. Brr, I'm a little dragon. Woo, I live here. Rah. And he flies around, and, you know, it's a volcano or something like that. That is very irregular. You don't generally just get a single mountain off on its own. Mountains come in clumps, or that's why they're called mountain ranges. And they form where tectonic plates smash together. So a tectonic plate, I don't know exactly what it is, but it's kind of like an invisible line of where the Earth's crust or something is. I don't know. But mountains generally form where they smash together. So these dotted lines, let's say these represent our mountain ranges. A mountain range, as these two are kind of smashing into each other here along this kind of path, they would probably form a mountain line as the Earth is pushed together and pushed upwards. God, I'm going to make a mess of this board already. So imagine that we've got our tectonic plates there. Your mountain ranges will generally sort of appear in clumps and ranges. You might get larger, particularly large mountains, you know, your Mount Everest or your Mount Doom or whatever it is. And they also tend to split off quite a lot as well, I've noticed. They have like sort of branching paths. And that's where you create things like a valley and things like that. So we've got our mountain range. They form in these clumps. It's where the kind of things are smashed together. Mountains are also important to know because they determine where your arid areas would be. In real world life, rainfall and clouds as it passes over mountains gets dispersed. So normally what happens is one side of a mountain range will be incredibly drier than the other. The other one, you will get a very temperate climate. The other side, you get a very arid climate. So if I can grab like another pen color, like orange here. So we could say, for example, that this whole region here is going to be a kind of dry, it doesn't have to be a desert, but it could be a very dry, arid area. I think that's how they work anyway. So, you know, that could be our area. Whereas this area, you might get a lot of temperate lands, you might get forests, you might get kind of decent sort of like lush plains. We can throw in some happy little trees. You know, you might get like a lot of temperate forests and stuff like that all around this side, you know, grassy plains and that sort of thing. We'll just do this. Designate. So that's an interesting thing. So as rain passes over, it kind of gets cancelled out almost by the mountain range, and then this area becomes very dry. So that's important to know, and like I said, it can also help you determine where places like valleys are. This, in a fantasy realm, might tell you like, oh, well, dwarves live here, or this is where an orc tribe resides. These settlements are constantly being attacked by these orcs. There's a dragon that lives in the tallest peak in the Grasping Fang mountain range. The kingdom of this land is worried about that. Go on, adventurers, off you pop, go and deal with it. It just kind of gives you those ideas, right? So that's one thing. Mountain ranges, not in just single ones, they come in clumps, generally follow where tectonic plates smash against each other, and one side will normally be drier than the other one. It's a little thing which you can keep in mind. The next thing I want to talk about is rivers, and this is one which, honestly, until a few years ago that I started like getting more into world building, I would have gotten wrong. I never learned this in geography, or again, if I did, I never remember it. But rivers, couple of things. One, they always start higher up and then they flow down towards the sea. Rivers don't flow upwards. You don't get a river that does like this and then ends in a mountain range, right? That doesn't happen. What you do get is a river will start high and it will flow down to sea level. So, for example, you know, we might have one river start here and then it flows through and goes out to the coast. You know, we might have another one flow up here and then flow down. Now, it's important to note that rivers will take the fastest and easiest route down to the coast. You might be asking, so why aren't rivers straight lines? That is because they cause what they call a meander, is where hilllands or a mountain or something like that would force the river to flow upwards. They don't do that, so instead they go around it, and that's where you get these meanders. So what you could know from this is if we've drawn a river like this, there's probably some hilllands here and here, you know, maybe a couple of hilllands here as well, little hills here. Maybe these are sort of like slightly more rocky or terrain around here, and so it flows through. Okay, so you kind of get these. Couple of other things a lot of people get wrong. Rivers don't do this. They don't ever split. Rivers don't split. The reason they do that is because they follow, the easiest and deepest channel towards the ocean. If there was two routes, it would just pick one and all the water would go down, whichever one was lower down or easiest, right? Rivers, however, do merge. So you could have another river go from here, and it might do this because around here is really, really hilly, and this is the only way that it can kind of get to the lowest point, and so it merges and it joins up with this larger river. Where they do this, this would probably become a much wider river, you know? Whoa. Oh my god, this is going to look terrible, but you get the idea. Okay, so as they join, more water's being flooded into it, etc. They also might join up and form lakes. So for example, you know, we could have this river going like this. There might be another one here. Oh, this area happens to be like a big basin of water or like a large sort of like recessed section. So we're going to form a lake. And then out from the lake, it will normally have a channel out to sea. And that's this one here, you know. So that's kind of how lakes form. One thing I learned recently is you can also get sometimes what is called, I think it's called like a bend bow lake, where you might get like a kind of moon-shaped lake like this. And it's because this section of the river has been cut off by either land growth or something like that. Something has sparked it off, and so it kind of separates and it becomes a little moon lake like that, which I thought was quite sweet. Deltas are things where you normally get them in deserts or areas where the soil is kind of a bit screwy. So you can get this. Now this isn't technically a river splitting. The river is still flowing out, but this area around here is kind of a bit weird, and so the water is finding multiple channels to get down there. What this happens to cause is if you get a delta like this, this land all becomes very, very fertile because it's got lots of water. So what you often find is deltas are terrible for building structures or cities because the land is very soft. They are very, very good for growing food, raising animals, etc. A lot of game parks and safari parks in the real world happen to be built around deltas because they attract a lot of wildlife, the land is very fertile, etc. So a couple of things there to think about. Rivers can have offshoots, so you can have brooks like this. So you can kind of have like little streams and brooks kind of come off. They tend to be quite rare. I don't know what causes them. I just know that they exist looking at real world river maps. So you can have them do that. They will tend to be much thinner and they tend to be quite babbling little brooks. One thing which I'm always quite guilty of is I don't often make my rivers long enough. Like, rivers travel a long bloody way. They go from mountains to the sea, and that means that they can go very, very far. You know, they will tend to take the shortest route, but if they've got to cross wide across a country, that can create quite a long river. I'm trying to think there. Yeah, just look at real world ones. There's loads of really good river maps out there which you can check out, and they will give you some ideas. The last thing to really talk about, because I think that if you just take on board a few things about mountains, a few things about rivers, they will help you in creating much more believable, much more authentic kind of geography maps. The last couple of things I'm going to talk about with the map here is climates. It's always very useful to know where your climates are. Now again, you don't have to follow Earth's thing of cold, cold, warm. You don't have to follow that. Yep, that spells warm. You don't have to follow that idea. You don't have to have cold, cold, warm. You could have cold in the middle, and then it gets warmer as you get to the further points. I don't know. It depends on how the sun or magic or whatever works in your world. But it's useful to know, and it's useful to kind of break it up into sections like this, like we have the equator, like we have the poles, because it allows you to then look at your landscape and go, okay, I know that this middle area is at the equator, it's going to be warmer, so you dry it out, maybe it has dry seasons, it doesn't get a lot of rainfall, and that will shape the climates around it. Climates are very important. There's a reason we don't build cities in the Arctic. There is a reason that, you know, cultures develop differently at the equator than they do in Europe. There's, you know, temperature and weather massively affects this. So it's worth just keeping an eye on, have a think about how it works. You know, there's lots of different climates in the world. You know, you don't just have like cold, warm, hot, cold. You can have dry seasons. You can have, you know, temperate, humid, but dry in the winter. So you get lots of snowfall, you know, that sort of thing, rather the other way around. You don't get a lot of snowfall, but you do get a lot of rain. You can have it where during the summer it's very dry, but during the winter there's a lot of rainfall and it's very cold, so you get a lot of snow. Look at real world geography, look at real world climates. They're massively, massively helpful on this. With this in mind, and this is where the video is probably going to be a bit long, this is where you can then start to think, well, okay, how does this affect where I place cities, where I place settlements, where I place dungeons, etc., and things like that. And this may sound strange, but this is where the game's Civilization is a big help to me. Because by playing Civilization, I think now more about like, well, I'm not going to build a city, you know, in the middle of cold town where there's no resources. Like, this is barren tundra, there's nothing here except maybe a few hills, you know, blah, blah, blah. It's kind of crap. I'm not going to build a city here, right? There's nothing there. There's no fresh water, which my people need. There's no food. There's no resources. I would probably look at going like, oh, here's very nice. You know, ooh, building a city there. We've got access to lumber for production. We're near the mountains, so it's likely that we'll get some mines and ore or stone. We're next to a fresh source of water, so we can clean, we can keep ourselves fed and healthy, we can grow crops. That's very good. I might build, you know, a city down here. Okay, we don't have access to the mines and the hills, but we still got fresh water, but we're close to the coast. You know, we can build a little port. Have some sailing ships go out. God, that's an awful looking ship. There we go. Looks more like a weird ocarina there. You know, we can build a dock, and that allows us to trade with foreign nations, and that's how we get our resources. You know, on the edge of a lake. You know, that's a good place for a city. In the desert, okay. Maybe we don't want to build one just completely in the middle of the desert, but hey, you know what? Building one next to a delta with lots of food and animal cart life, fresh water, some hill lands where we might be able to mine resources. Who knows what kind of rare magical resources might be in the desert as well. And that's the nice thing about fantasy as opposed to civilization in the real world is, you know, maybe you do build a town sort of like, you know, up here because around it there is super valuable mineral resource. You know, oh, electrum or arcane dust can be farmed by the butterflies in these forests up here, you know? Like, oh, these forests are where the elves live and they've got the magical butterflies that allow us to enchant weapons. Ooh, yeah, we'll build a city up there. Okay, maybe you have to have a well, maybe there's an underground spring, and it's limited in water, but you can still do it, you know? Like, oh, here's the magic elf town. Ooh, look, we've got tents because we're different. Doo-doo-doo. You know, that sort of thing. So you can take those in mind, but just remember that most civilizations are going to want water, food, resources. Additional benefits. Building close to a mountain gives you a defensive position. Building on hills makes you more defensible. Building in the middle of a desert probably makes you quite defensible because people don't want to trek through the desert to get you. Building on a coast gives you access to trade, etc., etc. And then if you start looking at this, that's when, you know, things like borders can start to arrive. You know, basically this is probably one big kingdom because it's kind of separated. Maybe, you know, elves are slightly different, but, you know, this is primarily going to be the sort of like main hub of this empire because that's where most of the cities and civilizations are going to be built. But maybe they have a few more like lumber yards up here. They have a few fishing villages along the side, but this would make a good empire. Likewise, your kind of classic desert empire over here. They, you know, people develop here, they acclimatize, they're going to stay in that sort of area. Maybe this valley, which we didn't really kind of nestle down, maybe this is an area. They've got a very defensible capital up here in the mountains. Very, very difficult to assault because of where it's positioned. They build like walls, you know, in the valley so that people can't get them. Highly defensible, and then they've got their resources, like they've got fishers down by the lake who send food back to the capital, that sort of thing. That can all be really, really useful in designing your world. So, last couple of things we're going to really talk about here. The first one is, following on from that lengthy discussion about geography, do remember that this is fantasy and sci-fi. Everything I talked about makes sense for creating realistic worlds. You don't have to make everything realistic. What I would say is it's good to have the realistic stuff. It's good to have most of your rivers start high, flow down to sea level. Most of your mountains are in ranges and have clusters. You know, they form in naturally locating areas. It's sensible to have your deserts where it would make sense that there's no rainfall. What you can do though, with fantasy and sci-fi, is you can change things up. You can switch the rules around. On occasion, you can create a forest that is dry, but has magic growing trees out of it. You can have a river that flows upstream because it's connected to the Feywild. You can have waterfalls that come out of nowhere and seem to feed into a lake in the middle of nowhere. Like literally water just sprouts out of thin air and fills a lake. The more and more of those things you have in your world that break the rules, the less special they become. If you have lots of rivers that flow upstream or lots of lakes that just appear in the middle of the land for no good or magic reasons, they make the ones that exist less special. If your players come across the only lake in the world, which is in the middle of a desert for no reason, there's no rivers or anything nearby, and it's fed by water elementals, that's, you know, where they come from. That's interesting. It makes your players excited. It makes them feel that this is unique and special and that it's magical, and it kind of emphasizes all the things we love about fantasy. It makes them ask questions. Why? How? Blah, blah, blah. If that's every lake in the world, it just becomes a normal part of their world and it becomes less special with it. So whilst you can absolutely break all of these rules, you can put whatever you want in your world, remember that the more you do something that is unusual to us as normal people, the less special it becomes. I just crushed a remote under my hand. The last thing I'm going to talk about today is the idea of building out or building in. This is something which really just depends on the type of DM you are, and it's very much an individual choice here. The concept of building in is you construct your fantasy world, you build your world map, you populate it with absolutely everything in broad strokes. You go, here's the continent of this, here's where the major cities are, here's where the villages are, here's where the dungeons are, but I don't, maybe each of these locations has 2 bullet points. That's all I know about it. As your players go to these places, you fill out the details. You go in and say, the players look at the map and they go, oh my god, there's so many things. We're going to go to Dreadmist Caverns. And on your notes, it's like, Dreadmist Caverns, goblins live here, there's an ancient shrine to Tiamat. You're like, cool, see you next week, folks. And then you go away and you go like, right, let's detail Dreadmist Caverns. What's in here? Why is it there? What's it doing? Blah, blah, blah. You fill out the details as you go. The idea of building out is basically the opposite. You focus in on a small part of your world, a town, a valley, a village, a region, and you detail it. You write loads of information about, this town, here's a full write-up of that town. These dungeon locations, there's 2 or 3 of them around nearby, fully note them out. These little settlements around, details. You sprinkle it with details, and then as the party explore out from that town, as they go, well, we've done everything here, we've saved the town from the gnolls that live in the hills, we've defeated the necromancer who was in the ancient keep, we've done all this, the town's thanked us, they've paid us, now we want to go to the capital, which they've said is, a few days ride to the north. You might not have that capital on a map yet. So when the players say that that's what they want to do, you start building out. You make the world bigger as the party's knowledge and the party's awareness of that world grows with it. I would say that latter option is what a lot of GMs tend to go with, and it makes sense. Very much like people reading a book or watching a TV show, you learn more about the world as your adventures and as the story within it progresses. That said, some people prefer the build-in approach. It makes them feel more confident in their improvisational ability, but it also gives the players a grand scope. It makes them feel like they are part of a fantasy, a living, breathing fantasy world. They have the feeling that first time you opened up the map in Assassin's Creed Origins or Skyrim, and you go, whoa, this thing is huge. I want to go and explore this place. I want to explore that place. It gives you this sense that you are a small adventure in a big, wide world, and that there's plenty of exciting opportunities. Neither option is wrong. Neither option is easier, I would say. Both have their merits, both have their pros and cons. It really comes down to the kind of feeling and game you want to create. If anything, if I was pushed, I would probably say that building out is easier for new GMs. You focus on one thing, you build the town, you fill it with cool people, you fill it with cool, interesting stories, you build a couple of interesting places around it, and then you let your adventurers grow and build as they go. But that isn't necessarily 100% for you. It can vary individually. So I don't want to say one is better than the other, but if you're a new GM, maybe consider that one first. And that's kind of all about it. I would say, well, just to give you a bit of anecdotal advice on this one, the original High Rollers campaign, the Lightfall campaign, which I'm probably still running as I make this, that was very much a build outwards campaign. I started with a small village called Tallfield. I had a number of adventure locations around it, and then I built the world outwards as they went. I did have a skeleton of the world map. I had created a world map, I had placed regions and a few kingdoms, and I knew where some places were, but it was mainly blank. I mainly left that map empty and open, ready for me to add more details as we went, and that ended up being the case. I added a lot of details from players' histories, I ended up adding, interesting spins on existing locations I had, and it generally developed over time. In terms of the only other advice I would give you is if you are making maps, whether they are small region ones or large ones, is leave empty space. Leave room for your players to kind of let their ideas manifest. Your player wants to come from a port city run by a thieves guild, but you don't have that on your map. Find a place to put it and make it happen. Make it part of that world. And if you leave yourself enough space, you can easily do that. So, there you go. That is it for this episode of DM 101. Don't forget, you can check out High Rollers D&D, the regular Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition stream. I do every Sunday, 5 p.m. GMT. I believe that's 9 a.m. PST. That's over on twitch.tv/yogscast. There's going to be more and more awesome High Roller stuff coming up very soon. You can also check out some of my stuff on the DM's Guild, where you can buy my Lightborn race, as well as my revised Elemental Monk, and maybe some more exciting things to come very, very soon. I will put a bunch of links in the description to everything we talked about in today's video. As always, please do share this around if you think it will be useful to people. Please leave your comments. I'd love to hear from you. Tell me the things I got wrong about geography and tectonic plates. And generally just show me your support and everything, whether it's a like, whether it's a share, whether it's a comment, whatever it is. I love hearing from you guys. I really appreciate all the support as well. Thanks very much, and I will see you for the next episode of DM 101.